Hi everybody, and welcome back to The Learning Curve. I am really excited to introduce my first guest to you because she's amazing and you're going to find out why. Her name is Jana-Rae Yerxa, and she's the professor coordinator of the Aboriginal Community Advocacy Program at Con College here in Thunder Bay. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, much for having me, Sandy.
Oh, are you kidding? You were the first person I wanted on here. So as I mentioned in the beginning, today we're talking about allies. We're specifically talking about non-Indigenous people who see what's going on with Indigenous people in Canada and they don't like what they see. Maybe they've already started looking at their privilege and seeing how things are different for them. They want to help, but they don't know what to do and they're really scared of going too far. So Jana, I wanted to ask you, talking about people like that, what can they do?
What can they do? That's a big question, right,
Yeah.
Sandy? I think that when we're talking about allyship, one of the first things that we need to talk about is how allyship is not a designation. It's not an identity that somebody claims. I think that it is really something that is action-based. And because it's action-based, you need to continue to stand in solidarity for whatever struggle or cause you're supporting with marginalized groups, right?
Right.
So when we're talking about Indigenous people specifically and people that are non-Indigenous, people that are settlers, Canadians, immigrants that might not like what they're seeing and they're wanting to stand in solidarity, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah.
And like you mentioned, they might be looking at their own privilege and unpacking that. I think one of the big things is to begin to question what their own personal relationship is to settler colonialism and looking at how settler colonialism has impacted their identity and how it has impacted their views of Indigenous people. And I need to say that when it comes to looking at how we've been impacted by settler colonialism, Indigenous people need to do that work just as much.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, knowing you has taught me that. And so I ask that question all the time, but I love what you just said, and I always do every time I talk to you, but that being an ally is not a title. It's not something you just claim. It's not something on a business card. It's action oriented, right? You
Yes.
have to be out there doing something, right? And I think of Facebook.
Yes.
And all the people that just want to claim that I'm an ally, but they really don't do much more than that. Now, what about all those people who are afraid of crossing the line because they know Indigenous people have been hurt incredibly by mainstream policies and systems, and they don't, their worst fear is they don't want to add to that. So what would you say to them?
Well, I would say that everything is contextual based. I think the context is really, really important when we're talking about, you know, how do I proceed? How do I move forward? How do I act?
Yep.
And so I think that it's so important for people to, I think we need to think of it as our responsibility.
Nice.
We all have a responsibility to disrupt settler colonialism all the time, every day. That's what we need to do. All of us collectively need to do that, whether we are Indigenous or not.
Yeah.
However, when we are working together, I think it's really, really important for people that are non-Indigenous to listen, to follow in some cases, and you know, not to take up so much space.
Yeah.
What I really love is when people are willing to stand in solidarity without taking up space. They show up, they support the cause, and they're wanting to stand in solidarity without taking up the space.
Yeah.
When Indigenous people's voices are the ones that need to be elevated in that moment. However, because it's context-based, and when we're not always there, and say that if there's racist comments being said I think it's the responsibility of everybody to let people know that, you know what, that's not okay with me. Here's why it's not okay.
Yep.
Taking that moment to provide some education and to disrupt it.
Exactly.
Because
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've said that so many times that I need to hear your voice saying this is not okay, and not just when an Indigenous person is in the room, or not just when something horrific happens on the news. We need to hear it all the time in those conversations.
We need to make it not normal.
Exactly.
Right? And when we're talking about racism, anti-Indigenous racism that is pretty prevalent here in our city, it's so important that we connect it to the larger structure of settler colonialism and see how that racism is a tool to normalize.
Yeah.
You know, because one of the ways that this project continues to operate is by dehumanizing Indigenous people to justify the theft of our lands.
Yeah. You touched on something, we were chatting before the program, and you touched on something that I was just like, yes, which always happens when I listen to you. But with the cross-cultural communication training I do, if there's one thing I've noticed about mainstream culture or people raised in that culture, they've got to the point where they know they should ask before they just go do something. Right. But they haven't yet figured out that we have the right to say, no, I don't want to answer that question, right? They get offended. Right. For example, our regalia, right? They'll walk up to one of our dancers and say, oh, you know, what is your outfit? And we're going to assume they say outfit and not something worse. That what does your outfit mean? And for a lot of us, that's very personal. We don't want to just be sharing that with a complete stranger. And they take offense when we say no.
Right. And I think taking offense is part of the way settler colonialism manifests in that interaction that you're highlighting. Because one of the things with settler colonialism is it conditions people that are non-Indigenous to have Indigenous people knowledge for consumption. And so it's tricky. I understand that it is tricky for non-Indigenous people who are wanting to come out of that and wanting to have more just relationships. And, you know, so when you say like Indigenous people have a right to say no, but then it's like, well, how do we learn? Yeah. Right? How do we learn? And so I think that one of the things that is important that is missing maybe in that type of context is a meaningful relationship. Exactly. It's so important for us to build relationships. And one of my mentors, she talks about how, you know, we need to be having dinner together. We need to be having coffee together. We need to be inviting each other over to our houses and knowing each other's families. She talks about that a lot. And I agree with that. Like, we do need to build meaningful relationships with each other so that when people are wanting to learn, it's not extractive. It's not just about taking, but again, it's reciprocal.
Yeah, it's sharing.
Right? And I think that when we're talking about like allyship, and I don't know what word I would put in that in its place, but it requires vulnerability on all of our parts. How do we be vulnerable? So when we're looking at how we've been impacted by history and questioning our identities, that creates discomfort and that creates vulnerability, right?
That's excellent. I have to take a break. We'll be back in 30 seconds.